Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today we're going to cover wood turning safety fundamentals. We'll teach you all the things that you need to know to stay safe in your shop, and we'll cover some of the common mistakes and things we've had happen to us as well. Before we teach you what you need to know, let's show you some clips of what can go wrong in the shop and how to avoid it. Alright, in this video, this is me on the grinder. We have a full-length video on this one if you want to see exactly what happened and how to prevent it. But I got my finger stuck between the Varigrind jig and the grinding wheel. I was pushing too hard and not taking my time. So if you want, check that full-length video out. Alright, in this video, this one was really exciting. This one had the potential for some serious bodily harm or death. It was about an 8x8x8 cube, roughly 20 pounds, soaking wet. What happened was the guy had his speed control knob. He accidentally bumped that to max speed, so when he turned that piece on, it was going about 3,000 RPM, and fortunately it went straight up into the ceiling, came back down without hitting anybody or the other turners around him. So this is why we always say make sure you turn your speed control to 0 before you start your lathe. That way, when you're working with those bigger pieces, you're not going to be at risk of getting hit. Alright, so in this video, this one's a little exciting. This was a segmented piece that came apart. I don't know if it was because the wood was bad or the glue joints were bad, but I've known a lot of segmented turners who have been injured from those pieces coming apart. Biggest thing, make sure you're wearing proper protection, you're standing out of the line of fire, and you're making sure your glue ups are nice and sound. We've broken this video down into a few different categories, and the first one we'll start off with is the lathe. Before you start, make sure you thoroughly read your lathe manual and understand safe operation of your lathe and become familiar with all the components on your lathe. Understanding how the lathe works safely will help you diagnose any issues should your lathe need repair or if you're doing something unsafe. Once you understand how the lathe operates, you want to make sure it's set up correctly. Make sure that the legs and everything are securely fastened and that the feet and the bed are level. We also recommend on some lathes, if you can, adding a weighted shelf to it. Especially on the 3520Cs like these, we can add a board to it and then throw a bunch of weight on there. That'll give it more ballast and stability when you're turning large off-center pieces. Once your lathe is set up correctly and everything's ready to go, let's talk about some top tips when you're using your lathe and how to use it safely. One of the most important but often overlooked things is setting your lathe speed to 0 every time you switch pieces and when you turn off the lathe. A lot of times guys will go from a spindle project where they're turning 3,000 RPM, then they'll go and put a bowl on there and not realize that their speed control is still set at 3,000, and that can lead to serious injury or even death. Another good tip is to make sure you take your chuck key out of your chuck after you're done turning. A lot of times people will leave these in the chuck and forget it's there and turn their lathe on, and that can cause serious injury and it can damage your equipment. So make sure you always take your chuck keys out of your chuck when you're done turning. With the lathe, just like the grinder, you always want to stay out of the line of fire. Anytime a piece is going to come out of the lathe, it's always going to come out straight in line. So I always stand off to the side whenever I'm bringing a piece up to speed, or if it's a piece that I'm not sure how good the timber is, just make sure you stand out of the line of fire. That way it'll go over your shoulder and not into your face. Another good thing to do is practice the motion for hitting your stop button. Some lathes have a remote control box. That way you can have it closer to where you need it depending on your workpiece, but make sure you practice that motion. That way if there is a problem, you can easily access and find your stop button. A lot of times in safety videos you see people in an accident and they can't find their shutoff switch, so make sure you press that button, make sure you know where it is and be familiar with its operation. Our next topic is the wood or the turning material you're going to use. Before you turn, you always want to thoroughly inspect your material and make sure there's no checks, cracks, or any ring shake throughout the piece. Any cracks like this can cause that piece to fly apart and hit you in the face, so you always want to make sure there's no defects or loose bark as well. And if the piece looks pretty good but you're still a little unsure, just make sure you stand out of the line of fire like we talked about earlier. While we're talking about our turning material, one of the more common injuries we see is when guys are turning a bowl or a spindle that has a sharp edge on it. A lot of times they'll rub their knuckle against that on accident and that'll cut you open really fast. So what we like to do is round off any of those sharp corners unless you have to have it in there for your design. And if that's the case, just make sure you know where your hands are. Another thing to keep in mind is your turning material may be toxic to you and it might not be to others. So before you turn, check the toxicity report of the wood you're turning and make sure it's not going to affect you, and always wear a dust mask. Another thing when you're selecting your blank, when you're turning larger projects, you don't want to start out with a square blank like this. You want to go to your bandsaw and round that blank out. That way when you start it up and it's turning around 700-800 RPM, it's a lot safer to have rounded blanks than it is to have a square blank like this. The next topic we're going to cover is proper work holding techniques. The first one we'll bring up is the faceplate. A lot of times with faceplates, guys use the wrong type of screws and that can lead to serious injury. Some guys I've seen will use regular wood screws and those tend to snap off and it'll have your piece come off the lathe. So we recommend using the screws we sell. They're a square drive stainless steel screw that'll be much more durable and they're reusable. When you're using a faceplate, the bigger the piece is, the more screws you want to have in the piece. Most faceplates that come with the lathe only have 6, 7, or 8 screw holes for it, but the bigger you go, if you look at a one-way, they have up to 18 or 24 different screw holes you can use. So the bigger the piece, the more screws you need if you're using a faceplate. If you don't use a faceplate and you're going to be using a chuck, whether it's a recess or a tenon, you want to make sure that the tenon is sized appropriately for the workpiece that you're doing. The other thing you want to do is make sure that your tenon or recess matches the profile of your jaws, as they do vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. So make sure that you have a good work holding tenon or recess, and make sure that you don't have any gaps between the workpiece and the face of the jaws. This will ensure that your chuck has adequate gripping force and will keep your piece on the lathe. When it comes to jaw sizes, you obviously want to size your dovetail jaws to the size of workpiece that you're doing. For a 12-inch platter like this, I used 4-inch jaws. If you're going to be going bigger, obviously you want to step up and have as much gripping force as you can and lateral stability, so that's why you go to the larger jaw sizes. Another thing too is as you're using your chuck, you want to make sure to frequently tighten down these pinion gears, as the wood that's in the jaws will compress and slightly loosen up over time, so make sure that these are snug frequently throughout your turning process. Another thing is to make sure your spindle, your chuck, or whatever accessory you're using is properly installed on the spindle. You want to make sure you seat that fully, because most modern lathes come with a braking system and they break rather quickly, and especially with a large piece, it can overcome the braking action of your lathe and come unscrewed from the spindle and then fly off the lathe on you. So you want to make sure that when you mount your chuck or accessories, you seat it up really good. That way those mating surfaces are nice and tight and it won't come unscrewed when you slow the lathe down. And one of the most important things is you always want to use your tailstock for support whenever you can. If you don't use your tailstock, you don't have lateral stability to the piece and it's more likely to be thrown from the lathe. The next topic we'll cover is our wood turning tools. Make sure you buy your tools from reputable brands and manufacturers. That way you can rest assured you're getting steel that is designed for turning. Tools made from steel that aren't designed for turning could bend or break during the turning process and could get you injured. The next thing is always picking the appropriate tool for the job. For example, you never want to turn a bowl with a spindle roughing gouge. If it says bowl in the name, that means it's safe on a bowl. If it says it's a spindle tool, it's safe for spindles. So make sure you know you're using the right tool for the job, and if you have any questions, please reach out to us and we'll get you sorted. Once you've picked the right tool for the right cut, make sure you understand how to use the tool safely and efficiently. If you have any questions on how to use the tool a certain way, we have a ton of resources on YouTube as well as our website on how to use each tool safely. Another thing is you always want to make sure that your tools are nice and sharp. If you have a dull tool, it'll tend to you pushing too hard into the wood, which can cause a catch, or you can slide past center and it'll whip around and smack your hand on the tool rest. So make sure every time you're cutting, your tools are nice and sharp. Before you start cutting, you want to make sure that your tool rest is set at the appropriate height, which is usually right on center, and that'll change depending on the thickness and diameter of the tool you're using. Another thing is you want to make sure that the tool is on the rest before engaging in the cut. A lot of times beginners, they'll actually go up to get their tool on the tool rest and they'll hit the piece of wood, which will slam the tool into the tool rest, usually pinching their finger and breaking the skin open. So make sure that your tool is on the rest and supported before you engage your cut. Another thing is you want to make sure that your tool rest is as close to the workpiece as possible without contacting the work surface. Next, we want to make sure that we don't overextend our tool on our rest. A lot of times we see guys that'll have 5 or 6 inches over the tool rest, and that'll cause that tool to bend or snap the handle. So make sure that the tool is properly supported and you're not going past a safe point. A quick way to tell if you're sticking too far over your rest is that the tool has a lot of chatter and vibration. What you can do to remedy that is bring your tool rest closer to the cut, or you can go to a larger, thicker piece of steel or whatever tool you're using to make sure that the cut is properly supported. Our next topic is general shop safety and personal protective equipment. Whenever you're turning or working in a wood shop, you always want to make sure you have a high quality dust mask or respirator to protect your lungs from the irritants and dust and fumes when you're wood turning. The other thing you want to do is make sure you wear safety glasses that are ANSI rated. These are a Z71 Plus rating. These will give you good eye impact protection. And if you're turning larger pieces or things that might come off the lathe, you always want to wear a face shield that'll protect your face and your head from impact. Next, let's talk clothing. You should avoid wearing loose clothing or things that could become stuck or wrapped around the lathe as it's working. And you want to avoid wearing bracelets, rings, jewelry, and watches when you're turning, because when your hand's up near the tool rest, a lot of times you could come into contact with the chuck or the workpiece, pulling you into the lathe and causing serious harm. In regards to footwear, you want to wear some high quality boots or nice shoes. That way if you drop your tool or a chuck or something on your foot, it's not going to cut you open or crush your foot as well. Along with jewelry and loose clothing, you also want to make sure if you have long hair, tie it back up into a bun so it doesn't get wrapped around your spindle and rip your hair out. It's a big safety concern that's often overlooked, so make sure if you have hair, tie it back. We also recommend keeping your workspace and your shop nice and tidy. Take out all those excess shavings after a day of bowl turning, get those out of the shop. As those shavings dry, those will catch a spark really quickly and can burn your shop down. We also like to keep our shops free of dust and debris, as well as the shavings when they're on a concrete floor like we're on right now, they get really slick. So usually what we do is throw down some sand and then just sweep occasionally throughout the turning process. We also recommend having a fire extinguisher or two in your shop in the event of a fire, but hopefully if you take all these previous steps, you can avoid a fire in the first place. When you're working with flammable materials, make sure you leave those finish rags out to dry completely, that way they are no longer flammable. Recently we had a local turner almost burn his entire house down because he left some finish rags on his table which caught on fire and almost burned his house down. So make sure you take those outside and let them completely dry. As always, if you're new to the hobby, make sure you get proper training from vetted individuals and take it slow. Don't start out with a 20-inch platter for your first project. Start out with something small, get your feet under you, and then get proper training and then have fun going up with bigger pieces and different projects. Hopefully these tips will save you guys an accident or two, and if you have any other tips or any good accident stories, leave them in the comments so others can learn from those as well. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos.